Societal mindsets should be conditioned by public discourse, and the best actor to shape this is not from a monolithic government, but rather the people themselves. 2 points of contention for today. First of all, on who best shapes societal mindset positively. Secondly, on the second speaker's argument, which wasn't very distinct, but also about rape culture system. First point of contention about the distortion of societal mindsets. He started by telling us that youth and children today are impressionable. But note that in their argument, they were telling us about clearly discriminatory song lyrics. So for instance, about how homosexuals should be beaten up, for instance, or how they clearly do not belong in our society. Let's consider this carefully. If children are really as impressionable as they claim, then they are likely to realize that such lyrics spread and invite outright condemnation from society. This is the kinds of lyrics which society itself doesn't accept. So if children are impressionable, they are going to be able to read the societal signals and realize that such actions are clearly not what we stand for. Thank you. But secondly, they were careless in their argumentation because they only focused on children in their first figure and never considered other people along that spectrum. So let's talk about people who are homophobic or sexist, for instance. It's far worse on the side of the proposition because they're never forced to confront or defend their own prejudice with an outright ban. Even though such song lyrics may not permeate our society, they no longer have to question whether their prejudice is defensible. Thank you. At least on our side, without a ban, people are forced to respond to other people in the society about why they think homophobia is acceptable, about why they think women should be secondary to men, for instance. And it's only in our case where we shatter that echo chamber and make people more likely to be free of these prejudices. But what about people on the middle of the spectrum? And we cannot hear that artists change. Artists don't remain as entirely homophobic singers or entirely sexist singers. Often, across multiple albums, they become, you see, a slightly more misogynist style, for instance, but over time, they sometimes become more accepting of women as well. And it is incredibly important for people listening to their music because you take them on a very relatable journey about how you can correct these perceptions of homophobia and sexism over time. They're able to relate themselves to the artist and imagine themselves in the shoes, thank you, and it's precisely that which is most effective in correcting societal minds. So thank you. But let's do a simple comparison here. If proposition characterizes for us today people being passive recipients, we think that outside is far better because we force an active kind of contemplation on their part instead of merely being passive recipients to a state-imposed ban. But secondly, even if we accept that characterization that people are purely passive recipients, then we think our counter policy of educational campaigns is likely to be far better because an educational campaign is likely to be more reasoned and informative, and an outright ban is silent and doesn't inform people what exactly the rationale behind their ban is. So we think outside only makes people more willing to take a stance against homophobia and sexism. But next, on the second speaker's argument about promoting